Show me your face.
You don't want that.
I didn't ask what I wanted.
She was born with a face the kingdom was forbidden to see. For 18 years, no one looked at her, not her guards, not her healers, not even the priests who prayed outside her door. Because the moment someone did, the prophecy said the world would end. The dungeon had no mirrors. Eliana didn't need one. She'd memorized the shape of her own hands, the sound of her own breathing, the exact number of stones between her cell and the door. Because those were the only things she was allowed to know. Her face was not one of them. She kept it hidden even from herself, hood drawn, eyes down, 18 years of practice turning her body into a shield against her own reflection. Then came the footsteps. Not the guards, she knew their rhythm by heart. These were slower. Heavier. Unhurried in a way that only came from a man who had never once been told no. The torches along the corridor bent toward him like they recognized something the prisoners didn't. He stopped outside her cell. Show me your face. Eliana's chains scraped against stone as she stepped back into the dark. You don't want that. I didn't ask what I wanted. A gloved hand slid between the bars. And before she could stop him, before 18 years of warnings could catch up to her mouth, her hood was down. The silver markings along her cheek ignited like veins of moonlight. The king went very, very still. Because the girl the kingdom called a curse was the mate the prophecy had been warning them about all along. Comment where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello and see just how far this story has traveled. The stone beneath Eliana's cell had a memory of its own. She had traced every crack in it 1,000 times, counted every groove worn smooth by 18 years of pacing, until the floor felt less like a prison and more like the only thing in the world that had never lied to her. She had been born in that cell, or close enough to it that the difference didn't matter. The healers who delivered her had taken one look at the faint silver lines already tracing themselves across her newborn cheek and gone pale. By the time she was old enough to understand words, she understood one before all others. Cursed. No one told her gently. No one told her at all, really, she simply absorbed it the way she absorbed the cold, from the walls themselves. The guards who brought her meals never met her eyes. The maids who once dared bring her a blanket wouldn't touch her hands when they passed it through the bars. And the priests, on the rare nights they were sent to check on her, always recited the same words before they left, like a warning nailed above her door. When the cursed Omega's face is seen by the Alpha King, the kingdom shall either rise into a golden age, or burn beneath the moon. She didn't know which future she was supposed to be more afraid of. Both had her name on them either way. So she made herself small. She kept her hood raised even when she slept, even when the cell was empty, even when there was no one left to see her but the rats that scattered through the grates. If no eyes could find her face, then maybe the prophecy would simply forget she existed. Maybe the kingdom above her, the one she'd never seen, never smelled, never felt sunlight from, would go on turning without her ever tipping it toward ruin. It was easier to believe she was dangerous than to hope she wasn't. Far above her, in a palace that had never once heard her voice, Alpha King Rowan sat through another council meeting he had no patience for. He'd inherited the throne young, and with it, a kingdom of old wolves who still spoke to him like he was the boy who used to trail after his father's boots instead of the man who now wore the crown. They spoke of treaties, border disputes, grain shortages in the eastern packs. He listened, because a king was supposed to listen, but his attention kept snagging on something smaller. Something none of them wanted to say out loud. He'd heard the rumor first from a stable hand, of all people. A boy who swore his uncle worked the lower dungeons and had once, just once, glimpsed a girl chained in the deepest cell, a girl no records accounted for, a girl the guards weren't permitted to discuss. Rowan had asked his advisor about it directly. The old wolf's face had shuddered like a door slamming shut. There is nothing beneath the fortress that concerns your majesty. Which, naturally, meant there was. He asked twice more over the following weeks, always met with the same practiced deflection, the same tight smile that didn't reach anyone's eyes. The council found reasons to change the subject. His own guards suddenly developed convenient memory lapses. And the more they danced around it, the more Rowan's instincts, the ones that had kept him alive through 2 border wars and 1 attempted coup, began to hum with warning. A king who was lied to by his own council was a king who had already lost something without knowing it. So on a night when the moon hung low and heavy over the fortress, Rowan did what none of them expected. He walked down. The stairwell beneath the fortress hadn't been swept in years. Rowan's boots stirred dust that had settled undisturbed, and the deeper he went, the colder the air turned, until his breath fogged in front of him despite the season above ground still being warm. No guard stopped him. No guard dared stop him, but he noticed how the few he passed wouldn't hold his gaze, how they seemed to shrink into the walls as though hoping the stone might swallow them before they had to explain anything. At the bottom, past a corridor lined with empty cells, 1 door remained locked. He heard her before he saw her. The soft scrape of chains shifting against stone, the sound of someone trying very hard to become invisible. "Open it," he told the guard trailing behind him. The man hesitated. "Your Majesty, the council." "Open it." The door groaned on hinges that hadn't moved in longer than they should have, and Rowan stepped inside. She was pressed into the far corner, hood pulled low, chains pooling around wrists too thin for how heavy the iron looked. He could smell fear on her, sharp, old, worn into her skin the way fear becomes when a person has lived inside it for years instead of moments. And beneath it, something else. Something that made every instinct in his chest go still. "Look at me," he said, and even he heard how much softer it came out than he intended. She shook her head, voice barely above breath. "I can't." "Why?" "Because monsters shouldn't be seen." The words hit somewhere he hadn't expected to be struck. He crouched slowly, closing the distance without closing it entirely, giving her room to bolt if she needed to, though there was nowhere in that cell left to run. "Who told you that you were a monster?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence around her answered for every voice that had ever whispered it into her before she was old enough to argue back. Rowan reached through the bars. His hand found the edge of her hood, and he paused there, waiting. Some small, unfamiliar instinct in him unwilling to take this from her without her permission. When she didn't pull away, he lowered it. The silver markings along her cheek caught the torchlight and ignited, threading like moonlit veins from her temple to her jaw, alive in a way that had nothing to do with sorcery and everything to do with the way his entire body suddenly recognized her. The mate bond didn't ask permission. It simply arrived, slamming through his chest with the force of a collision he hadn't seen coming, and by the look on her face, the sharp inhale, the wide, stricken eyes. It had arrived in hers the exact same way. For a long moment, neither of them moved. "You're not a monster," Rowan said quietly. "You don't know that. I know what I feel standing in front of you. And it isn't fear." Word traveled through a palace faster than any messenger could carry it, and by morning, the entire fortress knew the king had gone into the forgotten dungeon and come back out with the cursed Omega's name in his mouth. The council convened before he'd even finished his morning meal. "You cannot bring her into the light," his eldest advisor said, voice tight with something that might have been fear, might have been guilt, Rowan hadn't yet decided which. "The prophecy. The prophecy is a story someone wrote generations ago," Rowan said. "I want to know why a child was locked beneath my fortress before I was born, and why every one of you has spent years making sure I never asked." No one answered him directly. That, in itself, was an answer. "She is my mate," he said, and the room went utterly silent, as if he'd set something on fire in the center of the table. "Whatever she is, whatever you believe she'll do to this kingdom, she does it standing beside me, not chained beneath it." The kingdom will not accept her. Then the kingdom will learn to. Outside the council chamber, word spread through the halls, through the markets, through packs that had never once seen the girl they were suddenly terrified of. Some whispered that the king had lost his senses. Others whispered older things, about the silver markings, about the eclipse that was still months away, about a darkness some claimed had been sealed beneath the fortress since before any of their grandparents were born. Rowan heard all of it and ignored every word. He returned to the dungeon himself, refusing to send a servant in his place, refusing to let her first steps into freedom be handled by anyone but him. When the final chain fell from her wrists, Eliana stared at her own hands like they belonged to someone else. "I don't know how to leave," she admitted, voice trembling. "I don't know what's up there." "Sunlight," Rowan said. "Mostly sunlight." It startled a sound out of her. Not quite a laugh, but close enough that something in his chest loosened at having caused it. The walk up the stairwell took longer than it should have. She flinched at every torch, every echo, every shift of air that felt unfamiliar against skin that had known nothing but stone and shadow for 18 years. When they finally reached the door at the top and it swung open onto the courtyard, the light hit her so suddenly she had to shut her eyes against it, one hand flying up as though the sun itself might strike her down where the prophecy never had. "It's all right," Rowan said, low, steady, a hand hovering near her back without quite touching. "It's not going to hurt you." Slowly, she lowered her hand. The sky stretched wide and blue above her, wider than she'd ever imagined a ceiling could be. Wind moved through her hair, actual wind, not the dead, stale air of the dungeon, and she stood frozen in the courtyard like she didn't trust her own legs to hold her upright in a world this large. Guards watched from the walls. Servants paused in open doorways. Every one of them stared at the markings on her face, and for the first time in her life, Eliana didn't reach for her hood. She let them look. Because standing beside her, close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed hers, was a king who had already looked, and hadn't turned away. "Where do we go now?" she asked. Rowan glanced down at her, something unreadable and steady in his expression. "Wherever you want. You get to decide that now." She didn't have an answer yet. 18 years of walls didn't unlearn themselves in a single afternoon. But for the first time since she could remember, the silence in her chest wasn't fear. It was something closer to hope. Follow along to see what the kingdom does when they realize the prophecy might already be unfolding, and drop where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello and see how far along in the story you are. The days that followed felt like someone had handed Eliana a life she didn't know how to hold. She learned the feeling of grass first, cool, damp, impossibly soft beneath fingers that had only ever known stone. She sat in the palace gardens for an hour her first morning outside, simply pressing her palms flat against the earth, as though she needed to prove to herself it was real and would still be there when she opened her eyes. Rowan found her like that, and instead of rushing her along to whatever royal obligation waited for him that day, he sat down beside her in the dirt, ruining a perfectly tailored coat, and said nothing at all. He just let her have the silence. It became a pattern between them. He never asked more of her than she could give. When snow came early that year, dusting the courtyard in white, she stood at her window for so long that he eventually appeared beside her without a word and simply opened it, letting the cold air spill into the room, watching her face as flakes caught in her hair for the first time in her life. She laughed, really laughed, and something in his chest cracked open a little wider every time she did. He started finding reasons to be near her that had nothing to do with duty. Walks through the gardens that lasted longer than necessary. Meals where he dismissed his advisors early just to keep the conversation going. She, in turn, stopped flinching when his hand brushed hers. Stopped pulling her hood up out of habit when servants passed. The markings along her cheek, once a brand she tried to hide, began to feel like something else entirely under the weight of how he looked at her, not with fear, never with fear, but like she was something the kingdom had been foolish to keep buried. "You still don't believe you deserve this," he said to her one evening, quiet, not an accusation, just an observation he'd been holding on to. She didn't answer right away. 18 years is a long time to be told what you are. You were never what they told you. She wanted to believe him. She was starting to. It was Rowan who found the first thread that would unravel everything. He'd ordered the old dungeon records searched, every ledger, every scroll, every dusty account that might explain why a child had been sealed beneath his fortress before he was even born. Most of what his men found was useless. Faded ink. Missing pages. Records that seemed to have been deliberately picked clean of anything useful. But one scroll, tucked in the farthest corner of the archive vault, hadn't been touched in generations. The seal on it was older than the fortress itself. The prophecy written there wasn't the one Eliana had grown up fearing. When the marked child's face is seen by the true Alpha, the ancient seal shall be restored, and the darkness beneath the kingdom shall remain bound forever. No mention of ruin. No mention of burning beneath the moon. Someone, generations ago, had rewritten the ending. Taken a prophecy about protection and twisted it into one about destruction, then buried the truth so completely that an entire bloodline had grown up believing they were a curse instead of a safeguard. Rowan sat with the scroll for a long time before he brought it to her. When Eliana read it herself, her hands trembled so badly he had to steady them with his own. They lied, she whispered. All of it. 18 years, and it was a lie. Not just a lie, Rowan said grimly, already turning toward the door. Someone chose to tell it. Someone benefited from you believing it. He found the answer in his own throne room, standing where an advisor had stood loyally at his side for as long as Rowan could remember. It hadn't taken much digging once he knew where to look, a discrepancy in the dungeon's old guard rotations, a signature on the sealing order that matched no council member except one. When Rowan laid the original imprisonment decree on the table between them, the man's composure finally cracked. You knew, Rowan said, voice dangerously even. You knew what she was. What the prophecy actually said. And you buried her beneath my fortress anyway. I protected this kingdom, the advisor said, but there was no conviction left in it. Her bloodline held power that could unmake everything we built. If she was ever seen, ever claimed. She was a child. She was a threat. She was family, Rowan snapped, and the room went silent at the force of it. Her ancestors bound that darkness so the rest of us could live free of it. And you repaid that with a cell. The guards took the advisor away in chains that night, the same iron, Eliana noted quietly, that had once wrapped around her own wrists. There was no triumph in the sight. Only a tired, aching grief for 18 years that never should have happened, stolen by a man who'd been trusted to protect the very thing he'd feared. But truth, once uncovered, didn't undo what had already been set into motion. The seal beneath the kingdom had weakened during all those years of lies, the darkness sensing, somehow, that its true guardian had been buried instead of honored. And on the night of the blood moon eclipse, it finally broke free. The sky over the fortress turned the color of old blood. The ground trembled. Deep beneath the palace, something ancient and starving began to claw its way toward the surface, and Eliana felt it the moment it stirred, felt it in the markings along her skin, which had gone from a soft, moonlit silver to something sharper, hotter, burning like they were trying to warn her. It's the seal, she said, breathless, gripping the edge of the balcony as the whole kingdom seemed to hold its breath below her. It's breaking. The ancient texts were clear on what came next. The only way to bind the darkness again was for someone of her bloodline to become its vessel, to take the burden back into herself and lock it away, this time not beneath a fortress, but within her own body, forever. She didn't hesitate. 18 years of being told she was dangerous had taught her, if nothing else, how to be the one who paid the price so others didn't have to. No, Rowan said the moment he understood what she intended. There's no other way. There is always another way. Rowan. I said no. But the ritual circle was already forming in the courtyard below, elders gathering with old chants on their lips, the darkness rising like smoke through cracks in the stone, and there was no more time left to argue. Eliana stepped into the circle because someone had to, because she had spent her whole life being told her existence was a danger, and some small, stubborn part of her still believed that saving them was the only way to make that true. The chanting began. The markings across her skin blazed white hot, and she felt the darkness reaching for her, ready to pour itself into her like water finding an empty vessel. And then Rowan stepped into the circle beside her. "What are you doing?" she gasped. "Sharing it. You can't, this isn't a burden you can just. You said it yourself. It needs a vessel." His hand found hers, steady even as the wind howled around them, even as the elders shouted warnings neither of them heeded. It never said it needed one. The mate bond between them, the same bond that had ignited the moment her hood fell in that dungeon, surged to life with a force that shook the very stones beneath their feet. Rowan gripped her hand and refused to let go, and when the darkness poured down from the fractured sky, it didn't find a single vessel waiting to be consumed. It found two. The burden that had been carved for one soul split cleanly in half, settling into both of them at once. Searing, vast, and suddenly, impossibly bearable. Eliana cried out as the weight of it hit her, but it wasn't the crushing, endless dark she'd braced for. It was something she could carry. Something she didn't have to carry alone. The markings on her face flared one final time, blinding, silver white, and then, slowly, impossibly, began to fade. Not vanish. Never fully vanish. But soften, settle, become simply a part of her instead of a warning branded into her skin. The sky above the fortress cleared. The blood moon dimmed back to ordinary silver. And the ancient darkness, split between two hearts bound by a mate bond older than the false prophecy that had tried to keep them apart, sealed itself away, this time, willingly, gently, without a single cell or chain required. The courtyard fell utterly silent, and then, slowly, someone began to kneel. Then another. Then the entire kingdom that had once called her a curse. Winter turned to spring by the time they crowned her. Eliana stood at the top of the palace steps in a gown the color of moonlight, the silver markings along her cheek soft now, more like starlight than warning, and looked out over a kingdom that had spent 18 years being told to fear her. They didn't look afraid anymore. Rowan stood beside her as the crown was lowered onto her head, his hand finding hers the way it always did now, steady, certain, like it had simply always belonged there. She thought of the girl in the dungeon who used to memorize the cracks in stone because it was the only thing she was allowed to know. That girl felt impossibly far away now, standing in the sun with a kingdom kneeling before her and a king who had never once looked away. "Long live the queen," the crowd called, and the words rang out across a kingdom finally free of a lie 18 years in the making. Eliana Rowan, queen of a kingdom that once locked her away, never cursed. Never a monster. Just waiting, all along, for someone to finally see her. That's the story, loves. Thank you for staying with Eliana all the way to her crown. Comment where you followed this from. I'd love to say a proper goodbye and hear which part hit you hardest.